Again, we're continuing Sefer Yoshua, but I'm spending a little time on some general information. Just to review a little bit and then go on to something new. The book of Yoshua has a lot of side stories, and we'll talk about the side stories, but there are two main things that happen in the book of Yoshua. One is the conquest of the land, and the other is the division of the land. In other words, the first half of Yoshua is devoted to the wars of conquering the various cities, and the second half of Yoshua is devoted to the tribal boundaries and the division. One is called kibush. Kibush is conquest. The other is called chiluk, meaning division. And according to Chazal, although you don't see it from the pasuk itself, each of those stages took 7 years. There were 7 years of kibush and 7 years of chiluk. And that's a very important number to remember, because many of the mitzvos teluyos b'aretz, many of the mitzvos connected to Eretz Israel, like Shemitah and Truma and Maser, did not begin when they entered Eretz Israel. It only began after the 14 years of kibush and chiluk. So that's very important in terms of calculating Shemitah and various other things. Now, it's complicated. This is a whole sugya in and of itself. Certain mitzvos are chal as soon as they enter Eretz Israel. Certain mitzvos are not chal until after the 14 years of kibush v'chiluk, so it's not a uniform rule. You have to look at each individual mitzvah for that way. But let's just say Shemitah and Yovel would be an example of mitzvahs that did not take effect until Eretz Israel was divided. You may be wondering, I understand why it might take 7 years to conquer. Why does it take 7 years to divide the land? Well, I'm not going to answer that today. Rest assured, after we discuss how they divided the land, you'll wonder how it could be done in 7 years, meaning it's such a absolutely complicated process that indeed it took 7 years. Now, what that means, though, is just to understand what that means. That doesn't mean that, like, nobody got their land, and then after 7 years, everybody got their land. It was a gradual rollout process, meaning some people got their land right away, and the last people didn't get their land till after 7 years. Of course, we'll have to discuss who determined who was first and who was last, and why would it be that way. Some of those are unanswerable questions. But once again, it's not a sudden all-or-nothing situation, but it was a gradual process. So we have kibush and we have chiluk. Now, one thing to know about kibush is, though, in spite of the fact that the land was not divided until it was conquered, that does not mean that Yehoshua conquered everything that is within the territorial boundaries of Eretz Israel. It's very important to understand that Yehoshua, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, did not give Yehoshua the ability to finish the mission. He conquered most of what was nichlal in Eretz Israel, but there were large sections that were not conquered until the period of the different judges. There were sections that were not conquered until David HaMelech, and there were even some sections that were not fully under Jewish control, even after David HaMelech. So the truth of the matter is, we never yet historically had all of Eretz Israel within our grasp. The ultimate realization of that, together with an expansion of Eretz Israel, will only occur Limos HaMashiach. But I think it's fair to say Yoshua conquered, 60%, 70% of the land was Kobush Tachas Yoshua after 7 years. Okay, yeah.
What about when Yaakov was Canaan and gracious?
I didn't hear you.
What about when Yaakov was Canaan and gracious?
So Yaakov Avinu was Kona, the city of Shechem. That's very true. But the problem was, you see, of course it belonged to Yaakov, but in the course of time, we happened to be in Mitzrayim for a long time, so it was taken over by the Canaanim, and therefore we had to reconquer it. Meaning everything that Yaakov acquired was lost, just like the old city of Jerusalem was taken away from us from 1948 to 1967. So essentially, the old purchase of Maras HaMachpelah and Hebron by Avram Avinu and Yaakov by Shechem, that just didn't happen. We had to fight for it. Okay. Now, I had mentioned that the mitzvah of kibush applies to all land that is within the territorial boundaries of Eretz Israel. And those territorial boundaries are described in the Torah itself. If you look in Parshas Masai, the last parsha in Bamidbar, Hashem says specifically, this is the land that you are commanded to conquer and take over. And it gives you boundaries, north boundary, east boundary, south boundary, and the western boundary is the Mediterranean. Right? So that's the easiest boundary to figure out. Even then, the Gemara in Gittin has an interesting discussion because, if you look at the coast, right, the coast curves inward. So when you say the Mediterranean is the western boundary, there is one opinion that says you draw a line from, in other words, the question is the islands that are included in the Mediterranean. If you draw a straight line from the north part of the northwest border to the southwest border, right? So because the coast indents, that means some of the ocean is going to be included in that point. Do the islands in that ocean have the status of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael? That's one issue. And there's another opinion that actually says, instead of drawing the line vertically from northwest to southwest, you draw two horizontal lines across the whole world. I mean, that would actually mean a large part of America might have the status of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, you draw a line from the northwest point and the southwest point, and you have two parallel lines that go across the whole world, and anything within those two parallel lines might have the status of Eretz Yisrael. So, who knows? Borough Park, may have the halacha of Eretz Yisrael, and the like. Some people say Eretz Yisrael has the halacha of Borough Park. Borough Park is more chashuv, whatever it would be. Okay, but we're not going to spend. Maybe later we'll spend more time on boundaries. But the Torah gives you the boundaries, and whatever is within those boundaries, there is a mitzvah on Klal Yisrael to conquer. Now, I had mentioned that according to the Ramban, that Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah even bisman hazeh. According to the Ramban, that includes not only living in Israel, but that even includes conquering. So according to the Ramban, the mitzvah of conquest even applies bisman hazeh. According to the Rambam, Maimonides, that is not the case. The mitzvah of conquest was given to that generation. The mitzvah of conquest and living in Eretz Yisrael, according to most interpretations of the Rambam, does not apply bisman hazeh. Okay. Now, then, at the very end of last year, we spoke about the fact that the Torah says that when you conquer the land and you encounter the 7 nations, the Canaani, the Chiti, the Amori, the Yevusi, the Girgashi, so it says there's both a positive commandment, Hacharem Tacharimem, wipe them out utterly, and a negative commandment, Lo Sechaye Kol Neshama. Do not allow a single person to stay alive. And the Torah makes clear this does not only refer to combatants, this refers to men, to children, to women of any age, to babies. You shall utterly wipe them out. Now remember, this is not Amalek. The 7 nations of Canaan and Amalek also is a mitzvah to wipe out. But they're not even related to each other. Amalek comes from Esav. Esav had a son, Eliphaz. Eliphaz had a son from his concubine Timnah, that is Amalek. So Amalek is from Esav. Amalek is from Avram's family, actually. The 7 nations of Canaan are the descendants of Ham. So they're very different, but they were what you might call the indigenous population of what it was called Eretz Canaan, and the Torah says we are to exterminate that population. So I mentioned there's the moral issue, which we'll get to, but I just want to understand this halachically to be sure you understand the two views. There's a very, very important machlokas, Rashi and the Rambam, how to understand the mitzvah of eradicating the 7 nations of Canaan. Because the Torah says, whoever you make war, you're supposed to offer them peace before you make war. How do you reconcile that? And of course, we have the problem in the book of Yoshua, when Yericho was conquered, Rachav the Zaina, Rachav the prostitutes, managed to make a deal that because she gave shelter and protection to the Meraglim, the 2 Meraglim, she was given a promise that she would stay alive, and anyone that was brought into her home would stay alive. And as a sign that her house was protected, there was a red string that was outside the door. So when the Jewish people came in, they saw not to do that. L'chaira, how could Rachav be saved? She is of the 7 nations. And throughout Nach, we find people, an Amalek person even, we find different people who seem to be from the 7 nations who are living in Eretz Yisrael, and there's not necessarily a death threat. So let me first mention Rashi's Shita, and then I'll mention the Rambam Shita. I think I may have reversed it. According to Rashi's Shita, the rule of Shalom only applies before the Jewish people cross the Yarden. Before the Jewish people crossed the Yarden, they sent letters to all of the population of Canaan, and they offered them 3 possibilities. Number 1, if you want to get out of here, just leave. You have the right to leave. And that's why, indeed, we are told one nation accepted that offer, the Girgashi. That is why, for example, the Girgashi is one of the 7 nations, and yet, in most of Nach, when it talks about Yoshua waging war, it does not mention the Girgashi. It only mentions 6 out of the 7. It usually doesn't mention all 7, and Chazal say the Girgashi just left Eretz Yisrael. They went to Africa. So that's option number 1, leaving. Now, okay, I'll come back to that. There's a question with, okay. Option number 2 is agreeing to peace. You're allowed to stay, 7 nations, if you agree to terms of peace. This is called Kriyas Shalom. And Kriyas Shalom includes 3 things. It includes an agreement to abide by the 7 mitzvahs of Noach, not to become Jewish, but to abide by the 7 mitzvahs of Noach, which would include, for example, renouncing terrorism and the like. Number 2, well, I'll give you the Hebrew terms, then we'll see. Mas is taxation, and avdus is slavery. Now, these terms are a little misleading because if you read it literally, that means the only type of peace would be if they agree to be slaves. But both Rashi and the Rambam don't explain avdus that way. They explain avdus as simply acknowledgement of Jewish sovereignty over the land. And mas is a willingness to participate in the national service obligations that even the regular Jewish population had, meaning to say, so it's not as bad as it sounds. It doesn't mean the peace is you have to be a slave. The peace basically means, number 1, you accept the 7 mitzvahs. Number 2, you acknowledge Jewish sovereignty over Eretz Yisrael. Number 3 is you commit yourself to national service obligations. That may not be the army, because just like in modern Israel today, we don't take Arabs into the army because there's a problem of loyalty issues and the like. But whatever service obligations there are, you participate in. So this is called Kriyas Shalom. And we're going with Rashi here. This was sent before they crossed the Yarden. If the populations agreed, or if an individual agreed, this could be done one by one by one. So if a city didn't agree, but one person agreed, that one person could be saved. Now, the third option is if you don't leave, not you, but if the 7 nations don't leave Eretz Yisrael and don't accept the peace terms, at that point, we wage war against them, and we are commanded to eradicate them. Now, according to Rashi, the options applied only before we cross the Yarden. This is the critical point. Once we cross the Yarden and our peace terms have not been accepted, we're now in a state of active war. Now, it's hard to understand this. I can't say I fully understand the internal logic of this. But according to Rashi, Once you're in a state of war, which really takes effect as soon as you cross the Ardennes, even before you start the battle, surrender is not possible. This sounds very strange. Surrender is not possible. Even if a city of the 7 nations were to surrender to us, we would have, according to Rashi, an obligation to eradicate them. They don't have, again, I say that I'm repeating this because it does sound very strange to me. I don't understand it totally, but even if they want to make shalom, meaning, according to Rashi, even if they say we accept the 7 mitzvahs, the exception might be the following. Even like Rashi, there may be one exception, where even after we cross the Ardennes, we allow the 7 nations to accept the 7 mitzvahs. And that is, if this is a group that is outside of Eretz Yisrael, either because they were located outside of Eretz Yisrael, or because they ran away, and they want to come back in, so according to Rashi, we could let them in based on Kriyas Shalom even after we cross the Ardennes. But vis-a-vis the inhabitants who did not leave Eretz Yisrael, there is literally, according to Rashi, no surrender option for the 7 nations. Lo sechaye kol neshama. This is Rashi's Shita in Chumash. Rambam in Hilchos Malachim and Ramban in his Perush Ala Torah argue with Rashi, and they take the position that even after we cross the Ardennes, we give the Umos, the 7 nations, the opportunity of shalom, and therefore, and apparently that's whether you start fighting or you didn't start fighting yet, meaning to say, if in the middle of a war, a city basically says, we surrender and we accept your peace terms, we would be allowed, and maybe actually commanded, to accept their surrender. Now again, this does create the problem of, well, what if it's insincere? How do you know? Those are problems, but we do accept their peace terms. So this is a very, very big machlokas in Rashi and the Rambam regarding Kriyas Shalom. Now remember, there was no obligation for them to become Jewish, and according to the definition of Avdus, there is no obligation for them to be slaves. Okay, this is actually an important point. Both Rashi and the Rambam do not understand Avdus as slavery. They understand Avdus in kind of a non-literal way, really, the acceptance of Jewish sovereignty over Eretz Yisrael. That's what it means to be an Eved. We acknowledge, or they acknowledge, this is a Jewish country. And indeed, this is the institution that is called a ger toshav. Right? We know the word ger, the stranger. There are 2 types of gerim. We only have one of them today, really. A ger tzedek is a non-Jew who has converted to Judaism. And the ger is a Jew. A ger tzedek is a Jew. So when we say ger today, we typically mean a person who was born a non-Jew who has converted to Judaism in a halachically proper way. So they're a Jew. But there's another type of ger that exists in halacha that's called a ger toshav. A ger toshav is a non-Jew who did not undergo conversion, but has rights to live in Eretz Yisrael. A ger toshav. Toshav meaning a resident. And a ger toshav essentially means, it's kind of a quasi-conversion, but it's not really a conversion because even a goy is already obligated in the 7 commandments of Noach. But it means a non-Jew has accepted in front of a Beis Din that he will keep the 7 commandments of Noach and accepts Jewish sovereignty. That permits him to live in Eretz Yisrael. So, according to the Rambam, even the 7 nations can be gerei toshav. According to Rashi, the 7 nations could not be gerei toshav unless they indicated they would accept this before we crossed the Yarden. It's interesting, people discuss today, could we revive, because the Gemara says in a few places that the din of ger toshav only applies, Gezeres HaKosav, when there is Yovel, meaning when there's the Jubilee year, which we don't have today because most of the Jews are not in Eretz Yisrael. So it's not really clear if non-Jews are allowed to live in Eretz Yisrael at all. Meaning to say, halachically, in order to live in Eretz Yisrael, you have to be a ger toshav. A stam non-Jew cannot live in Eretz Yisrael unless they were ger toshav. Problem is we don't have ger toshav today, ergo is non-Jewish residency even halachically allowed. Obviously, Israel is not a halachic state in that way, and I'm not pushing for the forcible expulsion of every non-Jew from the land of Israel. I don't want to get in trouble here, police investigation, calling for a riot, whatever it would be. But again, halachically, it would be very fascinating. Somebody could do a paper on what is a halachic immigration policy vis-a-vis non-Jewish population. Again, I'm not talking about terrorists. Terrorists could be expelled anyway, because obviously a terrorist has not accepted the 7 commandments of Noah. That's for sure. They haven't accepted the prohibition against murder. So I'm not talking about expelling, terrorists or whatever, but I'm talking about a regular law-abiding, non-Jewish person, a very, very fine person, a good person. But if you haven't had the technicalities of ger toshav, so the question is there a heter of residence? It's a very, very interesting question. Okay. So this is a huge machlokas in Rashi and the Rambam regarding the mitzvah of kriyas shalom. Now, let me add another complication, another glitch in this that messes up the water even more. And that is, Chazal Darshan, the very last war that Moshe Rabbeinu fought in his lifetime, before they crossed the Yarden, obviously, was the war against Midian. Remember, this was after Bilam tried to curse us, and we were commanded to wage war against Midian because their women enticed the Jewish people into adultery and avodah zarah. And that war against Midian, by the way, is a source of many, many important halachas that we actually don't know from earlier wars. It is the source of the halacha of kashering, because it mentions the pots and the pans that you got from the Midianites, which were used with non-kosher food. So if it was like a spit or a grill that absorbed directly by heat, you have to kasher it by fire. And if it was absorbed by liquid, like a pot, you got to kasher it by hot liquid. The whole law of kashering a kalim, the way it absorbed is how it cuts out, is from Midian. Those halachas were given in the aftermath of Midian. Indeed, the Rishonim asked the kasha, what did they do in earlier wars? Didn't they have the same problems? Like, why is it only brought at this last war? Also, the mitzvah of taivel kalim, right? When you get pots and pans that were owned by a non-Jew, even if they're totally kosher, you cannot use them until you immerse them in a mikveh, if they're metal or glass. How do we know this? This is a lot of front people, certainly in America, don't even know this din. They've never even heard of this din. But it's a mitzvah d'oraisa for metal pots and pans. You are mechuyev to immerse in a mikveh, right? How do I know this? Midian. So Midian is both the source of kashering and it's the source of taiveling, but it's also the source of another mitzvah that's a little unique, and that is when we surround a city to wage war against it, we must leave one side open so the enemy has an avenue of escape. You must, again, sounds very strange. You must give, maybe I shouldn't say the enemy, but the population within the city, an avenue of escape. This is called Ruach Revius. This is a doraisa, and we learn it out of the war against Midian. what is the logic of the Ruach Revius? So the Rishonim give, Chazal don't give a reason per se, but the Rishonim give two reasons why there's a Ruach Revius requirement. Reason number one is compassion, that even though we have to wage war, we want to let the enemy possibly escape. We don't want to destroy people totally. Reason number two is a very interesting psychological reason. It's the idea that when people are trapped, they fight with a much greater ferocity. So if you trap people, the enemy will fight with such ferociousness that they may kill more of you. Therefore, once they have an avenue of an escape, they're not going to fight so hard because they figure they can always get out if it gets too tough. So it's an interesting machlokas. Is the concern rachamim for them, or is the concern rachamim for us, that we need to give them a way out? Now, Ramban says, quite logically, well, okay, let me go with Rambam first. When the Rambam brings the din of Ruach Revius, the Rambam does not differentiate between the obligatory wars against the 7 nations versus some optional war that the Sanhedrin authorized. Which means even in the wars of Yehoshua bin Nun, we give them an avenue of escape. At least this is how the Minchas Chinuch understands the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't say it beferish, but the Minchas Chinuch says, since when the Rambam brings the din of Ruach Revius, he is not mechalek in what type of war, so he wants to learn that the din of Ruach Revius even applies to a milchama against the 7 nations. Now, in some ways, this is consistent with the Rambam, and in some ways it's inconsistent. It's consistent with the Rambam in the sense that the Rambam maintains that even after we cross the Ardain, we give the 7 nations the opportunity of shalom, meaning we still give them a chance to live. So Ruach Revius is another way of letting them live. So that's consistent. But what's inconsistent is they're getting to live without meeting the requirements of shalom. The requirements of shalom are accepting the 7 mitzvahs, Jewish sovereignty, and national service. But you're now giving them another way, and that is just escaping by the open fourth side. It's a little strange. It's almost like, on one hand, the Torah is creating a halacha that says, these people must die unless they accept peace terms. And then the Torah says, but we'll create a circumstance where they're not necessarily going to die. Now, apparently what this would mean would be this. Apparently what this would mean, and again, I'm thinking out loud because I think as a parent, I myself am in a confused state. So forgive me for confusing you with my confusions. I give them the Ruach Revius and they escape. But if I encounter them the next day in Machane Yehuda and they didn't accept Shalom, I kill them then. Meaning, escape is not giving them permanent protection. It just means they escape. Now, if they escape and they go to Chutz La'aretz, so de facto they're not in Eretz Yisrael. There's no mitzvah to kill them when they're not in Eretz Yisrael. But in Eretz Yisrael, that doesn't give them protection. They are not Geirei Toshav. Now, again, obviously, the Gezeres HaKosas we have to accept whether they make sense to us or not. But realistically, it's hard to get your hands on this because that's like saying we got to give Hamas an avenue of escape in the middle of war. Now, maybe the assumption was, but it's only an assumption, that the only people that would take advantage of this are women, children, people who are not actively fighting, and no soldier is ever going to take advantage of this. maybe that's the assumption, but I don't think that's a realistic assumption. That's a lot of people are going to escape to do terrorism the next day. So it's a little bit of a tzarechiyun. Now, Ramban, however, makes the point, which to me is quite logical, that it has to be that the hanacha of Ruach Revius is only for optional wars, where there's no mitzvah to kill the population. When it comes to a mitzvah war of the 7 nations, it's not shayach to give them a Ruach Revius, because that would contradict the mitzvah to kill them unless they accept peace. So, yeah, not for me to pick or choose. It seems that the logic of the Ramban is easier for us to understand, I think, than the way the Minchas Chinuch understands the Rambam. That the Ruach Revius does not apply to the 7 nations, and I think the Minchas Chinuch says Rashi will certainly learn that way, because Rashi learns they don't even have the Shalom option. Once we cross the Yarden, they certainly are not going to have the Ruach Revius option. Okay, so this is important machlokas. So first of all, it's important to know this stuff, because at least you have a certain perspective. When people come to you and they say, the Torah allows genocide, the Torah allows ethnic cleansing, the Torah requires total eradication. Now, this doesn't answer all the problems, but at least you understand that there are certain options, whether it's Ruach Revius, whether it's Kriyas Shalom, and according to the Rambam, Kriyas Shalom even occurs after they cross the Yarden. So it is not as absolutely genocidal as you might think. So a lot of times it's important when people throw out these questions that you have the halachic background, so at least you understand exactly what it is. It isn't as, again, I'm not saying it's not bad, I'm not saying it's not hard to understand, but it's not as total as you might think. And indeed, let me point out, when the Rambam says there's Kriyas Shalom for the 7 nations, he also says there's even Kriyas Shalom for Amalek. The Rambam includes Amalek as well. Even Amalek, amazingly, is given the chance to remain in Eretz Yisrael if they accept the 7 mitzvos and Jewish sovereignty and the like. So there are options there that can prevent the deaths of these nations. But as the Sefer HaChinuch says, the overall philosophy of eradication is that these are nations that were evil nations. These are nations that would destroy us spiritually. We would learn from their deeds. And, there's a story, I think I may have mentioned it before, by Roald Dahl, is that how you pronounce it? D-A-H-L, British author. And it was a thought experiment about saving baby Hitler. I mean, he read the whole story about you're a doctor in Germany that's called in the middle of the night to a mother who has this beautiful baby in her holding, and the baby has whooping cough, and the baby is dying. And the mother is crying and begging the doctor, please, this is all I have in the world. This is my most precious treasure in the world. And as you're reading along, your heart is broken as you experience the suffering of the mother. He writes very eloquently. And let's assume that at that given moment, you were given a vision of clarity, that this is Adolf Hitler. This is Clara Hitler with his mother, Adolf Hitler. And you knew with absolute clarity that he would grow up to kill 6 million Jews and millions of other people as well. And you knew that. So what would be the merciful thing to do at that given moment in time? Here you have a mother and a baby crying, sobbing, begging. So is it merciful to save the baby so he grows up to be Hitler and kills millions of Jews? Or is the merciful thing to stab him and kill him right now? Now, the emes is, within our own Messiah, we have contradictions here. On one hand, we have in this week's Parsha the Ben Sorer Umayra, the rebellious son. The rebellious son is not even bar mitzvah. He's 12 years old, because I'll give a very narrow window. And he was guilty of stealing meat and wine from his parents and consuming it in a gluttonous manner. So his parents bring this juvenile delinquent to the Beis Din, and the Beis Din executes him. They stone him. They kill him. Ben Sorer Umore. Now, granted, there are many, many halachos that apply here ad kedei kach that the Gemara says there never was such a case. But another Mandi Amar says, oh yes, there was, and I was there, and I was at his grave. You know, how do you have a machlokas about that? But machlokas about Ben Sorer Umore. But the Mishnah itself is perplexed. Why is it Ben Sorer Umore chayav mitzvah? Number one, he's not even bar mitzvah. And number two, his sin is, at worst, is stealing from his parents. That's not a chayav mitzvah. Right? If stealing from parents would be a chayav mitzvah, a lot of kids would. I mean, kids take stuff from their parents all the time. So the Mishnah says, Nidain al Shem Seifei, that the Ben Sorer Umore is not punished for what he did. What he did isn't so bad. He's punished because, in fact, it's not even a punishment. He is taken out of the world, so he will not eventually do things that are so worse. So this starts a pattern of addictive behavior, which could eventually lead to murder. Molastem is abrios. And therefore the Torah says, let him die young and innocent, relatively innocent, and not die in a state of rishus. Which means he's not being killed because of what he did. He's being killed because of what the Torah says he'll eventually come to do, and it is to his benefit to take him out of the world now, so he shouldn't come to those averos. Now, this contradicts another teaching of Yishmael. When Avraham expels Hagar and Yishmael, we're going to read it on Rosh Hashanah, and Yishmael is dying of thirst, and Hashem was going, because of Hagar's prayer or Yishmael's prayer, Hashem was going to reveal a well to them. But the Malachi Ashares said to Hashem, let Yishmael die. His descendants will grow up and persecute Am Yisrael in such a bad way. Let him die. And what does the Torah say? Very important pasuk. Hashem heard the voice, the prayer of the Nar, the prayer of the youth, B'Asher Husham, where he was. So Chazal and Maseches Rosh Hashanah have a drasha. Hashem says, I don't look at the sins that a person will do in the future. I look at him right now. Now, granted, Yishmael is not necessarily super righteous right now. That's why he was expelled. But he's not deserving of death. When it says he's a tzaddik, it doesn't mean he's a tzaddik. It means he's not a person who is deserving of death. So the emes is, the Marshayas Takasha, you have a stira here between the idea of Asher Husham, that Hashem only judges you based on what you are, versus the Ben Sorer Umore, where Hashem judges you not based on where you are now, but based on what you will become. And you see the stira between Ben Sorer Umore, that is Nidain Al Shem Seifai, and Asher Husham, which means Hashem says, if right now you're okay, I'm not going to consider that which I know you will do in the future. Yeah.
Can you make a philip between what Hashem himself does, what his policy is like acting upon individuals, versus what he expects his people to do in such cases?
Well, I tell you, the logic of that, I think, would almost work in reverse, meaning I could understand Hashem taking into account future consequences because he knows them. I, Bedavka, couldn't tell a human being to do that. But of course, when Hashem commands me, Hashem is telling me what's going to happen. Okay. I'll talk about this tomorrow, but I just want to say one thing. The Chinuch seems to say that the mitzvah of eradicating Amalek and the 7 nations even if they're babies, is a getter like Ben Sora Umora, Nidain al Shem Seifai. Hashem is saying they will grow up to be the Hitlers. They will grow up to be the enemies. Now, granted, I as a human being cannot make those judgments myself. I couldn't make that judgment. How on earth would I know? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows. So the way we understand, so to speak, the genocidal halachas is that they are short-term cruelty for the purpose of long-term mercy. Meaning that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is basically telling me these will grow up to be evil people. Therefore, there's a mitzvah to eradicate them. But again, to throw out another confusion that I have, and that is the following. If according to the Rambam, you don't kill somebody until they're offered shalom, like Rashi, once we cross the Yarden, the option isn't there. But like the Rambam, even when I'm in Eretz Yisrael, I offer them shalom, and I give them a chance to accept. Don't you have a problem that the baby never had that opportunity? Meaning, if I have a 13-year-old kid, his life can be spared if he's willing to accept shalom. But if I have a 6-month-old baby whose parents didn't accept shalom, that baby doesn't have the option. Again, I'm just asking questions. I don't have the answer. Meaning, it's a little strange to me that the 13-year-old kid has a way to stay alive, and the 6-month-old baby does not have any way to stay alive. Essentially, he's at the mercy of his parents. Basically, if his parents accept shalom, he'll stay alive as part of the family. If his parents do not accept shalom, not. Okay, but be it as it may, this is the very important foundational machlokas, Rashi and the Rambam and the Ruach Revius. And based on this machlokas, we'll try to understand the various instances of Rachav and the Givainim and other people who were kept alive, and what would the basis be like each of those opinions. Question? Yeah.
Why don't they just ship the women and children away to different, like, Hutzarats far away from Eretz Yisrael?
Well, that's, I think that's a good, that's a good question even for the men, because keep in mind that according to the Rambam, they're given the right to leave. So the question is, if they're given the right to leave, then why can't we impose it on them? Meaning, if they say they want to leave, they can. So I don't know. And yet, it seems that if they don't want to leave, we kill them. We don't say we're expelling you. Maybe because the svara would be, if they don't want to leave, then even if they get expelled, they're going to come back. And maybe that's the connection. Yeah.
Why is it by Ishmael we say that Hashem says I can't judge them based on what he'll potentially do in the future, so don't kill him. Then it comes to Amalek, well, no, let's judge them now for what they're going to grow up to do.
Yeah. So l'chaira, the kasha is, this undermines the Marsha's own answer. The Marsha asked the kasha, what is the difference in Yishmael and Ben Sorer Umoreh? So here is what the Marsha says. The Marsha says, in the case of Ben Sorer Umoreh, the kid already exhibited the evil behavior that will eventually culminate. In the case of Yishmael, he didn't. Although I don't even understand that. I think he did. But the Marsha says Yishmael didn't exhibit the behavior of wanting to kill.
But that's the whole reason Sarah said he shouldn't grow up with Isaac.
Yeah, l'chaira, okay. But so the Marsha's question is difficult for your reason, but it's also difficult because that would not explain Amalek babies, because when you're killing the babies, they too have not exhibited any evil behavior. Now, it might be that perhaps vis-a-vis non-Jews, we have a different standard. Hashem judges on the future, meaning the rachamim of Asher Husham might only be to the children of Avram. Yishmael is not Jewish, but he's a child of Avram.
And Esav is the child of.
And Esav is
and he becomes from the father if you hold it from.
Amalek, okay, yeah, all right. It's a good question. I have to think about it, but it's a very good question. So there are really, really difficult steeras. When does Hashem look at only the present? When does Hashem look at the future? In the case of Amalek, where obviously Hashem is obviously looking at the future. In other cases, we find Asher Husham. Once again, it might be as well that when we are concerned with the Jewish population of Eretz Yisrael, we have to look at the future, meaning it's a very different situation because you're talking about poisoning society. It's a little different than Yishmael was a private thing. Yishmael was not going to be in Eretz Yisrael anyway. Hashem's plan was not for Yishmael to be in Eretz Yisrael. So on that, Hashem looks at him the way he is. When it comes to the 7 nations living in Eretz Yisrael, we got to be more concerned about the future. We can't just look at the present. We have to.
7 nations, he gives them the potential to lead.
Yeah,
Amalek,
so
no
we.
potential if you hold like Rashi.
Well, no. According to Rashi, according to everybody, Amalek and the 7 nations are the same. According to the Rambam, even after we cross the Yarden, even Amalek is given the right to leave. They're the same. They're the same. Okay, stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.